Any questions throughout this conversation, please feel free to drop them in the comment section of the Facebook live stream, or you can email them to info@markwarnerva.com. Today, we are joined by Lori Haas, the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, our Congresswoman from the 10th Congressional District, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, and our Senior Senator of Virginia, Senator Mark Warner. Senator, we're going to have you kick off the conversation. Please go ahead with your opening remarks.
Well, Jocelyn, thank you, and thank everybody who is taking a little bit of time out on this Thursday afternoon to be engaged in this conversation. It's always great to be with my dear friend and colleague, Jennifer Wexton, who's done a great job in one term in the legislature, in the Congress, and building on a great record she had in the General Assembly. And I know we need to return her. And with Shannon and Lori, who have been such tireless advocates for making sure that Virginia and our nation has appropriate gun safety legislation. And, you know, we have made a lot of progress, particularly here in the Commonwealth, because of Lori and Shannon and countless others across the Commonwealth. I know I want to be very brief at the outset because we'll get to lots of questions, but I do want to take a moment and pause, you know, to reflect on the incredible legacy of Ginsburg. She was a great justice. I have 3 daughters who are 25 to 30. Those daughters have grown up in an America that's more open, that's more just, that's more a country that is more about equal opportunity, not just for women, but people of color, for people to be able to marry who they care to, was a leader on issues around gun safety. The list goes on in terms of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's contribution to our country. And I have to say at the outset that it's unfortunate and I think wrong that before we've even appropriately mourned her passing, that this president and the Senate Majority Leader is trying to jam through another Supreme Court justice, even when Virginians are already voting, and take away our input, our collective input on who should be the next justice, when so many things from healthcare to gun safety to basic rights are at risk. So I look forward to the conversation, and let me now turn it over to someone who I've known both before she was in elective office and since she's been in. She was a great leader in the General Assembly and as part of a new Virginia congressional delegation who is looks a lot like more the kind of forward-leaning congressional delegation that we now represent in Virginia. Her election 2 years ago helped us switch our delegation from being way majority Republican to being majority Democratic. And we've got to make sure we build on those majorities this year. So Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to be a part of the new and improved Virginia delegation, and it's even better to be a part of the gun sense majority in the House of Representatives, which we elected in 2018. So I have had experience in the state level at the General Assembly and now at the federal level, and the change that we have seen in terms of gun violence prevention and how it moves voters is absolutely incredible. Very early in my tenure in the state Senate, I remember Lori Haas being the lone gun violence prevention advocate wandering the halls of the General Assembly building on gun lobby day. And now we have scores and hundreds of moms coming in their red shirts every year. And the elections in Virginia in 2019 are evidence of the power of the moms and a concerted efforts of voters when they care about an issue that's so important as gun violence prevention. You know, it is hugely important. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this gun sense majority in House of Representatives that passed universal background checks more than 575 days ago. We are still waiting on Mitch McConnell to take that up, by the way, Mark. So if you have any way of making him do that, that would be fantastic. But in the meantime, we cannot relent, because even in this time of COVID, gun deaths are increasing. You know, mass shootings are at the highest level since they started being tracked in 2013. Firearm fatalities increased 15% nationwide in March and in April. And so we need to do something about this. Firearms sales have skyrocketed in the time of COVID. So we cannot rest on our laurels. We need to remain ever vigilant. And I'm so glad to have these two fantastic rock star women, Lori Haas and Shannon Watts, working every single day to motivate people to get out and vote, because in 40 days, we have an opportunity to make a huge change. And I feel that the time has come for gun violence prevention at the national level. So I'm delighted to be here. I look forward to the conversation. I might have to hop off a tiny bit early because we're actually between votes right now, but I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll now kick it on over to Lori. Go ahead, Lori.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you. And as the Senator and Jennifer, Congresswoman Wexton referenced, this work has been long. The journey has been difficult at times in Virginia. But what we know and what we started, many years ago, I think back to the 2013 statewide elections when we elected a slate that not only ran on gun violence prevention, but they won. And we built on those victories over these many years that resulted in historic legislation at the Virginia General Assembly in 2021. I remember meeting with Senator Warner way back in 2008, where I'm going to age us both, Senator. When my work began not long after the shooting at Virginia Tech, when my daughter was injured. She's doing well now, as so many are who survive these shootings. But sadly, in the Commonwealth, and as the Congresswoman suggested, we have too much gun violence in all its forms, suicides and homicides and accidents. This issue needs to be addressed at the federal level. We're relying on that gun sense majority that was elected in 2018. We're relying on them to be elected and add more in 2020. We're relying on you, Senator Warner, and your leadership. We want the Senate to take these bills up. We want them to address this public health epidemic that too many families suffer from. So I'm glad to be part of this team. I'm glad to be part of this work. And thanks for having me, because this is an important discussion.
Thank you, Lori. I'll now go to Shannon. Go ahead, Shannon.
Hey, everyone, and thank you so much. It is such an honor to be on this call with fellow gun violence prevention champions like Senator Warner, Representative Wexton, and Lori Haas. When I think about all that we have accomplished together in Virginia over the last year, it really does give me hope for what we can do up and down the ballot over the next 40 days. And we're really using the playbook from Virginia's 2019 elections to flip state legislatures to gun sense majorities all across the country, and to have gun sense champions in Washington, D.C. As we all know, this has really moved from being a third rail issue to an issue that candidates are running on and that they're winning on. But that work takes time and persistence. And so I want to recognize all of the Moms Demand Action volunteers and gun violence prevention advocates who are watching right now. It's really because of your hard work that we took on the NRA in their own backyard and won. And now Virginia has 7 new gun safety laws on the books. So you've really shown the rest of the country that gun safety is a winning issue. But every single person has to get off the sidelines, and they have to do what we call the unglamorous heavy lifting of activism. Each of you that are watching, you're an engine that powers electoral results, and collectively, that power will lead us to victory in November. So if you can only even fit a few calls in between meetings or some texts while you eat dinner, every call and every text adds up. Our grassroots army has already made over 500,000 calls this election year alone. So even if we're not wearing out our sneakers, pounding the pavement, we should be wearing out our voices, phone banking. We should be wearing out our batteries by texting and emailing. And if you want to learn more about who is running as a gun sense champion, or find a text or a phone bank to get out the vote, just go to gunsensevoter.org and we will connect you right away. So thank you again for inviting me to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Shannon. Now we've got a number of questions. So our first one is from Marilyn from Virginia Beach. She asked, do you see access to mental health care as a means to reducing firearm deaths? If so, how will you work to increase access to mental health care?
Well, let me go ahead and take a first crack at that. Long after we have a vaccine for COVID, the mental health ramifications of the coronavirus will be with us. 7+ months of people in sequestration or in bubbles, and the stress this has put on. We've seen increase in violence. We've seen increase in child abuse. We have seen a host of mental health ills. People are experiencing variations on PTSD. So one of the things, and I commend Jennifer because the House has acted on this. We would like to act on this in the Senate as well to make sure we have those increased resources on mental health services. It's something as well I believe we need to do in terms of additional support for law enforcement officers so they're trained in how to deal with mental health circumstances, or can potentially bring along mental health professionals on calls where that kind of expertise is needed. It's not fair to send a law enforcement officer potentially alone. So I think this is an area where I hope we can find some common agreement, but it's going to take from the top down recognition of that, and that means we all will need to get out and make sure in these 40 days, and if you can vote early on these for President Biden, for Vice President Biden, hopefully President Biden. I hope you'll rehire Jennifer, and we've got 2 incumbent congressmen and a couple of great congressional candidates are so important in Virginia. And I would just make a personal plea here, as I know some of the folks who've been activists said, well, let me spend my time and effort elsewhere. Let's make sure we make positive results in Virginia first. There was a poll showing Biden's lead shrinking a little bit in Virginia today. And we know we're going to have 4 congressional seats that are up in potentially flippable one way or the other. So please, please, please contact our friends in Virginia.
And Mark, if I could touch on the mental health aspect of this as well briefly. In my prior life, before I was in the state legislature, I was an attorney, and I did a lot in the mental commitment field, both as an attorney and as a special justice. And I saw firsthand the issues that people dealt with trying to navigate the mental health system. Now, one of the important things to remember is that we need to protect and strengthen the Affordable Care Act, because the Affordable Care Act is why we have any kind of parity for mental health treatment at all. And it's also worth pointing out that Donald Trump is in court right now trying to strike down the Affordable Care Act. And when he manages to ram through the next Supreme Court justice, it probably will, that's all on the ballot right now, because they, it was a 5-4 decision on healthcare. And with Ruth Bader Ginsburg gone, there's no guarantee that the Supreme Court will uphold the Affordable Care Act. So it could all be lost. So that's another issue that we really need to make sure that we protect and strengthen the Affordable Care Act when we get our majorities in Congress. So yes, mental health is a big part of the issue, but we also need to help, easy access to firearms is a part of the problem, because I don't believe that in the United States of America, we have that much more mental illness and that much more, mental breakdowns. But what we do have that other countries don't is easy access to firearms. And it's also difficult to access mental health treatment. So we need to do both sides of the equation. That's why I support things like red flag laws, because I've seen firsthand the devastating consequences of easy access to firearms for people who are suicidal.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Our next question, Duke via email asked, if we cannot stop the prolific carrying of weapons, can we make it illegal to carry a loaded weapon?
Jennifer, you want to start with that one, or some of our gun safety advocates?
I'll take a quick stab at the carrying of firearms in public. Intimidation and bringing firearms to places and spaces where there is intended to have public discourse makes no sense. Firearms at city council meetings, firearms at permitted events, firearms in any government functions and in public spaces. We have a right to our First Amendment, and to intimidate and squash those rights to our First Amendment makes no sense in a democracy. I think there needs to be a careful consideration in looking at the open carry of firearms in too many public spaces and public events. It is unnecessary, when we have law enforcement who are responsible for safety and other public safety officials. I think it needs to be carefully looked at, and we need to be doing something about the intimidation that we are seeing from too many people carrying firearms in too many places.
I would just echo what Lori said. I mean, I think that we need to rethink the whole firearms in public spaces because too often that has been used to intimidate, not to protect.
Let me just add.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, you know, our volunteers have been showing up at city councils, as Lori mentioned, you know, Alexandria, Arlington, Charlottesville, Falls Church, Newport News, Richmond, most recently Fairfax, and have been getting them to pass resolutions to prohibit loaded guns in public spaces, sensitive places like playgrounds. And so that work is really important. Obviously, we'd like to see that at a state and federal level, but that work is happening.
And the real life example of what all of my friends have said is happening right now in Virginia as people go to vote.
Yes.
I mean, thank goodness to the General Assembly, we can vote early in Virginia in the midst of a pandemic. I strongly urge you to vote early, whether you want to do it by mail or in person. I've already voted early. I know Jennifer has already, I believe, has already voted early. You know, and it's just, to me, it seems not the American way that somebody is going to try to show up and you know, verbally or potentially intimidate with a firearm when you're out exercising your constitutional right. And this brings home even, you know, kind of beyond even just the firearms issue. I was the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee and very concerned about foreign intervention, particularly around Election Day itself and immediate afterwards. And was just, I didn't think Donald Trump would flabbergast me, but he did again yesterday when he didn't commit to a peaceful transfer of power. And I've been urging a number of my Republican colleagues have started speaking out. Marco Rubio has, and I commend him for that. But, you know, this election is going to be about what kind of America we have going forward. And people should not be intimidated in terms of their voting. And there should not be messages coming from the White House somehow implying that early vote or absentee ballots won't be counted appropriately. This culture of fear is something we need to move away from.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question is for you, Senator Warner, and Congressman Wexton. Sam in Woodbridge asks, what specific pieces of legislation do you support to reduce gun violence in our communities?
Well, I support all of the legislation that was passed by the General Assembly. And matter of fact, Tim Kaine and I have taken that legislation and introduced it as the Virginia plan. It didn't go as far as, frankly, I would like, but it has 7 separate pieces of legislation, and we thought might be a good starting point in a Senate where we're still in the minority. But I also think it needs to extend to assault weapon bans. And people have said to me, you know, and Lori being one of them, you know, Senator, you didn't used to support that. What changed? And what changed was Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook and the Pulse nightclub in Orlando and Las Vegas and the shootings in Virginia Beach, and the list goes on and on. And it is time to make sure that weapons of war, and I say this as somebody who owns a firearm, I own a shotgun and a pistol, and you know, but weapons of war should not be appropriately misused. So the assault weapon ban is part of that legislation that I believe would reduce the amount of violence.
And I would say the single most effective thing that we can have at the national level is true universal background checks, because now too many people are able to buy guns without any kind of check through the gun show loophole, through private sales, through things like that, where people who shouldn't have firearms are getting them, along with the red flag laws to help prevent suicides, and along with closing the boyfriend loophole to stop domestic abusers who aren't actually married to the individual or didn't live with the survivor, to keep those folks from being able to get guns as well. I think that those 3 or 4 things would go a very long way to help prevent gun violence in our nation.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and ask Lori and Shannon our next question. Kelsey from Midlothian asks, What can we do to make our schools safer and prevent mass shootings like we've seen at Sandy Hook and Virginia Tech?
Thank you for the question. The data shows us that our schools are, in fact, a very safe place for our children. There is more risk for firearm violence outside of our schools. And I would like to get folks to think about this. The majority of school shooters get their firearms at home. Think about that. And the majority of school shooters are current or former students. You can add all the layers of law enforcement, you can add all the layers of regulations you want to these schools, to our schools. But the reality is this is a step that needs to be taken in the home and in those spaces and places to keep our children safe. We need to lock up our firearms. At any age, a young person in a home is at risk from that firearm unless it is locked up. I think the suggestion, the safest thing is to not have a firearm in the home, but if you choose to own one, you must keep it locked up, unloaded, and separate from the ammunition, and the ammunition locked and stored. So that would be the single most effective thing we could do to prevent school shootings. Again, given that most school shooters get their firearms at home and most of them are current and former students. So let's lock up our firearms.
I would agree with everything Lori said. We have done extensive research on really what works to prevent gun violence in schools. And we know that's keeping gun violence away from schools before it can even begin, right? And so some of the laws that Senator Warner and Representative Wexton were just talking about, background checks, for example, red flag laws, those are things that would keep our schools safe. We know that from data. But the other piece, as Lori mentioned, 4.6 million kids in this country live in homes with unsecured guns. And that was before the historic number of gun sales that we've seen over the last several months. And so I'm extremely worried as schools go back in to session that even more kids will be at home with unsecured guns. And that is a true risk for our schools. Our volunteers have been working to ask school districts to educate parents about their responsibility to store their firearms safely. And we do that through a program called Be Smart. If you go to the website besmartforkids.org, you can find out all about how to ask when you send your kids to friends and families about how they secure their firearms. Again, as Lori said, locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition. And several school districts that we've worked with are sending this kind of information home with families in Los Angeles, in Denver, and Phoenix. And it's really important that we're asking our school boards to get involved so that families are educated about secure gun storage.
Thank you. Our next question is from Catherine from Chesapeake, and she asked, what are the specific obstacles to disallowing military weapons for civilian use?
Jocelyn, my apologies. I'm going to have to hop off. I've just gotten called to votes. But I can give a very brief answer to that one, which I can let the senator talk about a little bit more. Mitch McConnell is our number one number one limiting factor to getting that passed into law. Along with, of course, Donald Trump. So that's why we need to make some serious upgrades come November. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you all so much for all the great work you're doing. Enjoy.
Goodbye, Congresswoman.
Thank you for joining us, Congresswoman.
Goodbye.
And I would echo what Congresswoman Wexton just said. It is Mitch McConnell. It is Donald Trump. And remember, this was the law of the land. I believe the ban was initially put in place by Senator Feinstein back in 1994. It was the law of the land for many years. It finally expired, but during that period when it was the law of the land, and I was governor during that time. It was not like this was an issue that people were constantly talking about. So the fact that it would. Simply the notion of going back to what was the law before is some radical step. I just don't agree, and I think it is a sensible and appropriate action. And again, we just need to look at the use of some of these weapons, particularly with the tragedies that have taken place not to say time out and it's time to go back to what was law before.
Thank you, Senator. Lori, Shannon, do y'all have anything to add?
I would just echo the senator's thoughts. A large capacity magazine was used in the shooting at Virginia Tech. And we know, for example, in the Gabby Gifford shooting, when the shooter stopped to reload was when he was taken down. These are weapons of war. These are meant to kill as many people as possible in as short amount of time as possible. It's why we've seen the incidents and the horrific tragedies occur at an alarming rate once the assault weapons ban was allowed to expire back in 04, 05. These are weapons of war and they have no place in our streets. During the ban, subsequent to the ban, Virginia State Police and Richmond City Police reported on, not seeing these magazines in crime scenes, not seeing these weapons, and they had some positive results. The research, of course, didn't come out until after the ban expired, and then you had a period of time when, these were allowed again, and we're seeing the awful, dreadful results of these. And it's time, it's just plain time to take them off the streets. And I thank the senator for his leadership on this and for him talking about this and for him, committing to making this happen. Once November happens and once we get a gun sense majority in the Senate, in the House, and in the White House, we expect to, and I think the voters are demanding that this happen. So thank you.
Thank you. Our next question, Elizabeth Kopich asks, how can we address the issue of firearms in domestic violence situations? Senator, do you want to kick us off?
That goes, again, to, as both Lori and Shannon have said, if you have guns appropriately stored, as I do, if you separate the ammunition in moments of enormous stress, so you can't reach for that firearm in that moment of stress. If we make sure that we close the boyfriend loophole, we've managed to make sure that we restrict if you've been married, if you've had a child, if you've lived together, but that excludes a whole host of relationships where someone may have a history of stalking, and why would we want that person to still have that kind of access to firearms? And it goes back, I think, as well to the questions around mental health support. This is an issue that has not gotten enough attention, not only vis-a-vis gun safety, but just on a macro basis, that I think as we think about recovery and reopening from the coronavirus, prioritizing mental health resources, professionals, and training is going to have to be a much, much higher priority.
Excuse me, exactly, Senator. Domestic violence incidents have been reported to be on the increase since COVID. What we know and what the research tells us is a history of violence is the single biggest predictor of future violence. And we allow abusers to remain armed. Of course, that violence often results in terrible, lethal tragedies. We need to do a better job at recognizing the risk of firearm violence and mitigating that risk. Protective orders are one method. Temporarily removing firearms under risk orders is another method. And in the Commonwealth, it's law at the federal level, but it's not in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Certain violent misdemeanors need to be gun prohibitory. They can be gun prohibitory for a select amount of time, and if that person, gets the help he or she needs, as the senator suggested, and becomes a fully, healthy and whole member of society, and he or she can get their firearms rights back. But we need those kind of mitigations to, again, reduce access to firearms by a person who is at risk of committing violence.
And I would just add to that, the presence of a gun, we know in a domestic violence situation makes it 5 times more likely a woman will die. Nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot at or shot by an intimate partner. And yet there's this, what we call the boyfriend loophole in our federal laws, which means that dating partners and stalkers have easy access to guns in this country. We have not closed that loophole. And the Violence Against Women Act, which would close that loophole, is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. He has not allowed it to be voted on and reauthorized, even though it's passed the House. And the reason for that is because the NRA opposes closing that loophole, and they are going to grade lawmakers. So this legislation, which would help keep guns out of the hands of dangerous abusers, needs to be voted on and needs to be passed, and we will do that as soon as we elect a gun sense majority to the Senate.
Let me just add quickly to that, the Violence Against Women Act has always passed with overwhelming majorities. And I think even with the NRA against it, it would still pass with a dramatic majority. This is clearly the case of Leader McConnell using his power as majority leader to restrict the ability of the United States Senate to vote on something that would become law and protect women. And that's wrong, and it needs to change.
Thank you. We have another question submitted via email. It reads, veteran suicide is an epidemic in the US. An average of 22 veterans sadly commit suicide every day, and many use firearms. What role can legislation play in ending veteran suicides and all suicides by firearm?
Well, Jocelyn, let me start with that one. And to the questioner, luckily, the latest data shows that number has come down to closer to 17. But it's still a tragedy that has gone, unrecognized, underreported. And I'm very proud of the fact that I've worked on a bill that passed the Senate and just this week also passed the House, will soon hopefully be signed by the president, that says one tool, and there's no single solution here, but one tool is about 60% of the veterans who commit suicide have never had any interaction with the Veterans Administration. The VA has got challenges, but the VA, I think better understands veterans than most institutions. And I generally find from veterans, if sometimes too much of a hassle to get into the VA, but once you get into the VA, they at least understand your concerns better. But if 2/3 of these veterans who are committing suicide don't even have never had access to the VA and its programs, doesn't make sense. So my bill, bipartisan, with John Bozeman from Arkansas, puts hundreds of millions of dollars into nonprofit organizations in the community that can spot those veterans that may be having mental health issues, that may be on the verge, and gets them into a setting oftentimes where they need that support from other fellow veterans. And again, it will not stop every suicide, unfortunately, but it would be a dramatic step forward in a nation like ours, where we owe so much to the men and women who've kept us safe. We owe them this obligation. We owe them the mental health support they need. And I'm really proud this bill has now passed both houses of Congress and will soon become law.
Thank you, Senator. That is, your words couldn't resonate with the American public more. Persons are very concerned about the difficulties that our returning veterans face, and as they age, and all the circumstances and challenges they face. One area our research directs us to think about and we promote is lethal means safety counseling. We understand that for many, many people, suffering and in various ways and different crises, an attempt at suicide is impulsive. And if we can just buy that person the time and the care and the attention they need before they can reach for that firearm, we're going to save their life. Access to the firearm is and a quick, easy access to that firearm can often result in death by suicide. Whereas persons, generally speaking, who attempt a suicide and survive that attempt, they do not go on to commit a suicide. The recidivism rate is really low. So with lethal means safety counseling as a part of a care package that we provide to our veterans, we feel very strongly that along with the type of work you're doing to get them the care into their communities, we feel strongly that we can save lives.
And I would just add to that, we've done extensive research on this issue. About 11 veterans die every day from firearm suicide. That's about 4,200 every single year. We have found that veterans are 1.5 times more likely to die by suicide than non-veterans. Unfortunately, also firearms are increasingly being used in suicides among women veterans. That's the fastest growing veteran group. And so when we look at potential solutions to address this, one is utilizing red flag laws, which we've talked about a little bit, but it just allows family or police to get a temporary restraining order to remove the guns from people in crisis. Also promoting secure firearm storage, making sure guns are locked, unloaded, separate from ammunition. Encouraging healthcare professionals to talk about the risks of firearm access with their patients. Continuing to invest in research on the effectiveness of initiatives that provide suicide prevention literature at retailers, actual gun dealers. And then finally, continuing to do studies with the Veterans Health Administration to find out which services are most effective in preventing firearm suicide.
Thank you. And now we only have time for one more question. So I'm going to start off with Lori and Shannon. Suzanne via email asked, she said, I'm 73 and grew up in Richmond, Virginia. In my youth, we didn't have metal detectors or armed guards at school. There were no school shootings. The first one I remember was the shooter in the tower at the University of Texas. That was shocking because it was rare. Why can't we have limitations on the number of firearms an individual can buy?
I think her suggestion is one to consider seriously. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that we know that the majority of firearms in this country are owned by a far fewer number of people than anybody would imagine. We have in the Commonwealth of Virginia, during that 2020 session, that it was so historic that we've all, very proud of that work, passed a law that limits the purchase of handguns to one a month. I think that serious consideration can be given and should be given, to strategies like the one handgun a month, where we do limit access to firearms in certain circumstances.
I would just add to that, guns in this country have more than doubled since 1968 in the hands of civilians. We have about 400 million guns and very few gun laws. And look, if the NRA's experiment of more guns and fewer gun laws worked, we'd be the safest country in the world. Instead, we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any high-income country. And so it just goes to show you that this experiment in our country of allowing gun lobbyists to write our nation's gun laws has failed. And we know the vast majority of Americans support stronger gun laws. 90% of Americans, 80% of gun owners, about 75% of NRA members. This is not polarizing among the American public. It's just been an issue, unfortunately, with too many lawmakers who have been beholden to the gun lobby. Look, the NRA for a long time was the most powerful, most wealthy special interest to ever exist. Now they are in big trouble financially, reputationally. They are weaker than they've ever been. Our movement is stronger than it's ever been. And I am confident that after several election cycles that we've experienced, we are headed very quickly toward having the laws we need at a federal and state level to save American lives.
Well, let me follow up on both what Shannon and Lori have said. I think they have said it well. And again, this is a case where on the one firearm a month, that was Virginia law for a long time. It didn't restrict collectors who maybe deal in antique firearms. I think sometimes we've seen the gun lobby use the extreme case that people are antique firearm collectors. That's not going to change your ability, but it just says let's put some common sense conditions in place. They've been the law in the past. They've not unduly restricted collectors, and across the board. Again, I think Lori and Shannon both made the comments on so many of these laws. The vast majority of Virginians, including gun owners, support sensible legislation. Like on background checks, which I think Lori started out with, I think that the number was 86%. So this is an area where we can come together, where I still believe that I'm a Second Amendment supporter, but there are, as has been pointed out, reasonable restrictions that I think all Virginians, Americans shouldn't be able to support. I mean, I think about the comment from the last questioner. I mean, I remember as well that shooting in Austin, and it was rare. And if I fast forward to conversations I've had with moms in the last 2 years, where they talk about, how they have to pick the appropriate backpack with appropriate Kevlar to send their child to kindergarten or first or second grade. That is a fundamental change from the kind of America that I grew up in, and in many ways, even that my kids who were between 25 and 30 grew up in. Should not be as divisive an issue as it is. I do think there will be a gun sense majority, but that all starts this year in Virginia with getting out and getting people to the polls, with voting. We can vote now early. You can vote 9 to 5 in any jurisdiction in Virginia. Go to iwillvote.com and you can find where in your locality. And many communities like Fairfax County and others, there'll be multiple locations. There'll be a number of Saturdays. I can tell you as well, the postal system is safe. I think we've called out some of the inappropriate actions, and the postal worker is going to make sure your ballot is delivered. Make sure you mail it early. But please, this beyond just even gun safety, the kind of America that we are going to continue with, whether we preserve our democracy, whether we want to make sure our kids are growing up in communities that are truly safe, will be decided this November 3rd. Let's make sure all our voices are counted, and let's make sure the kind of great work that Lori and Shannon and others have done, and we've seen the difference already made in Virginia, has also made a difference at our national level.
Thank you. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Senator, if you have any last few remarks, this is the time.
Well, I would just say, to Lori and Shannon, and to so many others who've been part of this movement over the last number of years, it was either personal experience or experience of friends that drove you to this. And I commend the work you've done and the courage you've shown. And as one of the earlier questions should be, you need to keep that struggle forward, and we can't let others intimidate, interfere. But at the end of the day, all of this action won't result in change until we change some of the people in elective office. We've seen that happen in Virginia. With your help, we'll see that change at our national level as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Shannon. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.